Gabon just did something no one saw coming. No press conference, no long-winded debates, no transition period, just silence, followed by a clean, brutal break. After 18 years of allowing European vessels to sweep its waters, Gabon walked away, cold, quiet, and without looking back. For nearly 2 decades, massive EU trawlers harvested Gabon's rich marine life, tuna, mackerel, and more. In exchange, Gabon was promised development, jobs, infrastructure, a stronger local fishing industry. But those promises, they never arrived. The ports weren't built, the jobs never came. The supposed progress remained a fantasy. What did come, season after season, were the ships. They came, they fished, and they left with millions of dollars worth of seafood. Meanwhile, Gabon's own coastal communities remained underdeveloped, sidelined, and exploited. What was framed as a partnership turned out to be quiet extraction. And now, Gabon has finally said, enough. This isn't just about fish. It's about sovereignty, about an African nation waking up and realizing it's been giving away wealth for almost nothing. Because when you peel away the diplomatic language and legal polish, the truth is sharp. Gabon was trading its resources for scraps. So the big question is, why now? Why cancel the deal after 18 years and do it without explanation? The answer isn't just in the contract. It's in what was taken and in what was never returned. It's in the years of silence, of waiting, of watching the wealth leave and the promises fade. What Gabon just did isn't just a national move. It's a continental signal, a quiet act of defiance that could ripple across Africa. Because the age of quiet exploitation is ending, and for the first time in a long time, Africa is beginning to write its own rules. On the surface, it looked like a win-win. In 2007, Gabon signed what the European Union proudly called a modern fisheries partnership agreement. For a coastal nation with rich, untapped marine resources but little fishing infrastructure, the deal seemed to make sense. Europe would pay Gabon 1.6 million euros each year. In return, EU fishing vessels, mostly French and Spanish, would be granted access to Gabon's waters to catch high-value species like tuna. It sounded clean, simple, fair, but that's just the surface. What followed was something far more one-sided. Dozens of industrial trawlers began to line Gabon's coast. These weren't your average fishing boats. They were floating factories, equipped with sonar, satellite tracking, refrigeration systems, and nets big enough to drag an entire ecosystem in one sweep. Gabon brought the sea, Europe brought the machines, and Europe took the fish. And here's the twist. Those ships didn't even have to land in Gabon. There was no obligation to offload, process, or even stop on Gabonese soil. The catch went straight to Europe, packaged in Spain, labeled in France, sold across the EU as if it had never touched African waters. And Gabon? Gabon was left with almost nothing. No jobs, no processing centers, no ports, no value chain. Just the same empty promises and a trickle of cash. The kind of cash that can't build an industry, but can buy silence. The deal had promised investment in Gabon's fishing sector, jobs, training, infrastructure, a future, but none of that ever arrived. And maybe it was never supposed to. Because when a foreign deal lets outsiders take the resource but gives nothing back, you're not looking at cooperation. You're looking at exploitation, dressed up in suits, wrapped in contracts, and sealed with a handshake. What Gabon lost wasn't just fish, it was potential, economic potential, industrial growth, human opportunity. While European vessels raked in millions worth of tuna from Gabonese waters, the coastal towns of Gabon remained still, almost frozen. There were no cold chain warehouses bustling with activity, no seafood factories processing the daily catch, no training centers equipping young workers with the skills to cut, package, and export. The real engine of wealth, the supply chain, never made landfall in Gabon. And that wasn't by accident. The agreement didn't require it. There were no clauses demanding local investment, no promises of job creation, no safeguards to ensure Gabon would benefit beyond the small annual payment. For 18 years, Gabon received just over €1 million per year, less than the value of a few European shiploads of fish. But the real cost went far beyond money. Because Gabon wasn't just leasing out its waters, it was surrendering control. Even the data on how much fish was being extracted came from the European fleets themselves. There was no independent monitoring, no satellite surveillance, no verified reporting. Gabon had no way to confirm the numbers, no way to know if its fish stocks were collapsing, no way to enforce sustainability or protect the long-term future of its marine ecosystem. And the signs were there. Local fishermen began noticing something unsettling. The fish were disappearing. Traditional fishing zones were drying up. Nets came back lighter. Days at sea grew longer. Incomes dropped. But the foreign ships never stopped. They kept arriving, sweeping the waters clean. This was the hidden price of the deal, not just the depletion of marine life, but the slow erosion of Gabon's economy, its independence, and its pride. Gabon wasn't building a fishing industry. It was being quietly gutted by one. All of it happened legally, silently, systematically. For years, Gabon remained quiet. There were no public protests, no angry speeches in parliament, just a lingering discomfort that hung over the coastal towns like morning fog. Communities were struggling. Young people couldn't find work. Fishermen watched their nets come back emptier each season, and still, the government stayed silent. But beneath that silence, something was building. Quietly, patiently, resentment was growing. It began behind closed doors. Inside ministries and advisory rooms, questions started to form. If this so-called modern fisheries agreement was truly modern, why hadn't it transformed anything? Where were the processing plants, the skilled labor, the export industry? Why was Gabon still stuck at the beginning of the value chain? Those questions echoed in the fishing towns of Port-Gentil and Libreville, where the official narrative didn't match reality. Local fishermen spoke of aging boats, dwindling catches, and sons with no future in a trade that had been gutted by foreign ships. The industry was collapsing, and no one seemed to care. Even marine scientists raised quiet alarms. They noticed shifts in fish migration, a drop in key species. And still, the EU vessels returned each year, knowing full well that Gabon had no satellite monitoring, no independent data, and no way to enforce its rights. Change came slowly at first. Then, suddenly, everything shifted. When Brice Oligui Nguema became president in 2023, that quiet frustration finally met political will. He didn't need to tear up the system to see what was wrong. All he had to do was listen, and what he heard was a harsh truth. Gabon was no longer in control of its own economy. That truth was a breaking point, and it would soon become the reason Gabon made a move that would stun the world. When Brice Oligui Nguema assumed Gabon's transitional presidency, he didn't just inherit a title, he inherited a nation tangled in polished contracts and glittering promises that, beneath the surface, delivered almost nothing. On paper, Gabon had partnerships, but in practice, it had lost control. That's when Nguema did something unexpected. It wasn't a sweeping new law. It wasn't a media spectacle. It was a doctrine, a bold, unshakable philosophy that would quietly redefine Gabon's path forward. They called it the NUMA doctrine. Named after one of his closest advisors, it wasn't built on complexity or diplomacy. It was built on one simple, radical truth. A nation cannot develop what it does not control. Period. And with that, Gabon acted. In a single, deliberate move, the government withdrew from the EU fisheries agreement. No warning, no staged announcement, just a clear, sovereign statement. We are done. But this was never just about tuna. It wasn't even just about fishing. It was about something deeper. It was about reclaiming dignity. Nguema understood something fundamental. True development can't be outsourced. You can't grow an economy from promises written in Brussels while your own ports stay empty and your people stand idle. He wasn't rejecting foreign partnerships. He was rejecting partnerships that exported wealth and left poverty behind. Under the Numa doctrine, Gabon set out to rewrite the rules. No more foreign access without local benefit. No more exporting raw materials while importing poverty. From now on, if a nation wanted Gabon's resources, whether it was fish, timber, oil, or minerals, they would have to contribute to Gabon's growth. Tangibly, directly. Jobs, technology, infrastructure. No exceptions, no excuses. To President Nguema, the EU fisheries deal wasn't just economically lopsided. It was symbolically insulting. It offered a handshake on the surface, but underneath, it felt like a leash. A contract that dressed itself as cooperation but operated like control. Ending it wasn't just a policy shift, it was a cultural reset. It was a declaration that Gabon would no longer play the role of silent supplier. It would be a stakeholder, active, sovereign, and unafraid. In that single move, Gabon didn't just tear up a contract, it tore up a legacy of exploitation wrapped in diplomacy, a pattern that had held much of Africa hostage for decades. And with that decision, a new chapter began, not just for Gabon, but for every African nation watching closely. Europe was stunned. For years, Gabon had been considered one of its most reliable partners. Quiet, cooperative, predictable. The EU's fisheries agreement with Gabon had been renewed multiple times without protest, touted in official reports and diplomatic speeches as a shining example of sustainable development. But that illusion shattered the moment Gabon walked away. There were no warnings, no drawn-out negotiations, just a simple sovereign decision that spoke louder than any press conference. Africa is watching its waters now, and the ripple effects came fast. In Brussels, shock turned into quiet panic, because Gabon's exit wasn't just about tuna, it was about precedent. If Gabon could rip up an 18-year agreement overnight, what was stopping others? Eyes turned to Mauritania, to Senegal, to Guinea-Bissau and Côte d'Ivoire, countries with nearly identical agreements, countries where frustration had been building behind the scenes for years. Many had watched their fish stocks decline. Many had seen their local fishermen struggle while European ships swept the seas. But until now, none had dared to break the deal. In Senegal, protests by coastal fishermen flared back to life. In Mauritania, civil society groups started calling for full transparency in their European contracts. Across West Africa, Gabon's decision wasn't viewed as a withdrawal. It was seen as a spark. Because for decades, African nations were told that saying no would bring economic collapse, that walking away from Western deals meant walking away from progress. But Gabon proved them wrong. It didn't collapse. It didn't plead. It didn't isolate itself. It made a choice. And that choice shattered a global myth, that Africa's only role is to supply while others profit. Not anymore. What began as one nation reclaiming its coast is now being watched by an entire continent reconsidering its future. Europe isn't just losing fishing rights, it's losing its grip. And Africa? Africa is beginning to understand that its greatest power is the power to say no. Behind closed doors in Brussels, the panic wasn't really about tuna, it was about the template. For decades, the EU's fisheries agreements in Africa followed a familiar script: offer modest financial compensation, gain sweeping access to marine resources, and quietly move the profits offshore. These deals were framed as partnerships, but in truth, they were mechanisms for silent, consistent extraction. And Gabon had just broken that mechanism. What truly unsettled European policymakers wasn't the loss of a single agreement. It was the realization that the illusion of compliance had shattered. If Gabon, steady, predictable Gabon, could say no, then what was stopping others? The EU's seafood supply chain relies heavily on African waters. Tuna from West Africa doesn't just feed European families, it stocks supermarket shelves, drives port economies, and sustains entire industries in Spain, France, and Italy. Disrupt that chain, and Europe doesn't just lose fish, it risks billions in trade, jobs, and influence. The response from Brussels was immediate, but uncertain. Officials scrambled to control the narrative. Some accused Gabon of being reckless. Others suggested it was a political stunt by President Nguema to gain favor at home. But those arguments didn't hold. Gabon hadn't made a spectacle. It hadn't ranted or postured. It had simply made a decision, calm, clear, and grounded in self-interest. And that's what made it so powerful. Because Europe's grip on Africa has rarely depended on force. It has depended on expectations, on the assumption that African nations would remain compliant, that leaders would sign renewals without question, that the system would continue unchallenged. Gabon shattered that assumption, and the impact wasn't limited to Brussels. From Dakar to Bissau, from Lomé to Conakry, the ripple spread. Governments and civil society groups began asking the same question Gabon had once dared to whisper. If this is a partnership, why are we still poor? Gabon didn't just walk away from a fishing deal. It walked away from a deeply rooted structure of quiet dependency. And in doing so, it may have opened a door that others have long been afraid to touch. For 18 years, Gabon's waters were full, but its shores remained empty. There were no processing plants humming with activity, no refrigerated trucks on coastal roads, no marine science centers tracking ocean life, and no thriving local fish markets fueling regional trade. Just the distant hum of foreign vessels on the horizon, quietly extracting value that never touched the ground. And in the stillness they left behind, the real tragedy unfolded. Because what Gabon lost wasn't just fish, it was an entire ecosystem of opportunity. If those European ships had been required to dock in Libreville or Port-Gentil, things could have been different. Gabonese workers might have been trained to sort, fillet, freeze, and package seafood. Local entrepreneurs could have built transport companies, warehouses, export firms, with boxes proudly labeled "Product of Gabon." Young people could have found purpose in marine biology, logistics, or cold chain infrastructure. An entire industry could have grown from the docks upward. Instead, what the country got was a modest annual check, barely enough to build a port, nowhere near enough to build a future. And the damage wasn't just economic, it was informational. Without local landing requirements, Gabon had no way to track its own marine health, no reliable data, no visibility on overfishing, no science. It was left to depend on the very fleets doing the fishing to report how much they were taking. Imagine that, a sovereign nation asking foreign companies to define the limits of its own wealth. This is the void the Numa Doctrine is trying to fill. For the first time in decades, Gabon has a chance to build something real, a fisheries sector designed to serve its people, not just foreign markets, one that employs Gabonese hands, funds Gabonese research, and exports goods that actually carry the country's name, not just its resources. The path forward won't be easy. There's no proven roadmap. But there is something now that Gabon never had before, the will to begin again. And sometimes, that's everything. When Gabon walked away from the EU fisheries agreement, there was no shouting, no burning flags, no angry speeches, just silence, a calm, deliberate silence that echoed across Africa and left Europe stunned. Because Gabon didn't just end a contract, it ended a mindset. For decades, African nations were told to be patient, to cooperate, to sign deals where their natural wealth was extracted at sea while their people stood waiting on shore. But with one quiet, sovereign decision, Gabon shattered that expectation. It said, without fanfare or fury, "We are done playing small." Brice Oligui Nguema didn't make this move for the cameras. He made it because he listened. He listened to the absence of opportunity, to the silence of an industry that never materialized, to the fishermen watching their nets come back empty, to the youth searching for futures in a sector that had been stolen from them. His message to Europe was unmistakable. No more ghost deals, no more ghost fleets, no more ghost economies. And that message is traveling far beyond Brussels. Across West Africa, countries are beginning to re-examine their own agreements. Mauritania, Senegal, Côte d'Ivoire, nations with similar histories, similar frustrations, and now a living example of defiance not through rebellion, but through recalibration. This isn't isolation, it's intention, sovereignty with a strategy. Because what if Africa started saying no more often? Not to partnership, but to exploitation. Not to cooperation, but to concessions that left it weaker than before. What if every nation started asking the same question Gabon finally did? Who truly benefits from this deal? And what if the answer was no longer acceptable? Gabon may be a small country on the global stage, but in this moment, it's standing tall. It just exposed the truth behind one of Europe's quietest power pipelines. And in doing so, it gave something back to Africa that's more powerful than any contract or currency, a reason to believe that saying no can be the first step towards something greater. The fish are gone, but the future? That's still in the water. And this time, it belongs to Gabon. What started as a quiet exit from an unfair deal has become a loud wake-up call for an entire continent. Gabon didn't just reclaim its coast, it reclaimed its voice, and in doing so, it challenged every nation still trapped in the cycle of giving everything and getting almost nothing in return. This isn't the end of the story, it's the beginning of something bigger, a shift, a blueprint, a reminder that true sovereignty isn't given, it's taken back. If you found this video insightful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Let us know in the comments, should more African nations walk away from exploitative deals? And what country do you think will be next? Thanks for watching, and remember, the tides are changing. And this time, Africa is steering the ship.